thank you very much, Luuk van Middelaar, for accepting CIDOB's invitation to participate in this conversation. Luuk van Middelaar is a historian and political philosopher, professor at Leiden University, and a well-known author on European politics, who has published extensively on the state of EU politics, but also the EU's global role and its geopolitical stance, particularly also after the pandemic. In this conversation, we will be covering both aspects. We will be discussing how has European politics been transformed in the last few years. And of course, here we will refer to the work that Luuk has done on The Passage to Europe, a very well-known book, How a Continent Became a Union, published in English in 2013, but also the latest book, Alarms and Excursions, which I have here with me, which discusses how Europe has been improvising politics for the last few years, and particularly after the crisis. Then we will move to discussions on the EU's geopolitical role, also on the basis of Luuk's recent paper, Europe's Geopolitical Awakening, published at Le Grand Continent not so long ago. So Luuk, thank you very much for joining. Let me start with this first broad question on your knowledge on how Europe's policymaking processes work and how the machinery is put in place. You were an advisor to former head of the European Council, President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy. So you are a connoisseur of the European policymaking machinery. How would you say this machinery has changed over the last years, and particularly since Europe has been on a recurrent stage of crisis from one crisis to the other?
Well, thank you, Paul, first of all, for the kind invitation and your generous words of welcome. Very happy to be on your podcast. Well, on the question, I think there's indeed a broader change at work in the way the European Union works and functions, and also in the way European politics is perceived. And perhaps I first briefly sketch the general framework I see. And in my view, the European Union obviously has been built originally and created to build a market and to work as a rule-making, rule-setting enterprise. And this kind of politics I call a rules politics. And it's about very slowly, patiently setting up standards, etc., practices for products and people to travel freely around the continent. It's obviously a great accomplishment, as Brexit has shown how difficult it is to disentangle it. But it is not where in the past 10, 12 years, the most, let's say, political energy, dynamism, innovation, excitation, even opposition of the public has gone to. Because as you rightly say, the European Union is faced by a series of crises in which it had to do something else. It had to react to unforeseen circumstances, had to react quickly, sometimes in a matter of even days. When Greece was about to go bankrupt, when there was the migration crisis, or well, like just weeks ago when Belarus hijacked a plane. It's a different kind of action than this patient market building. And what you see in this change on the side of the decision-making machinery is indeed that heads of state or government united in the European Council come more to the fore. And whereas the traditional rulemaking, let's say, it's really the hallmark and the quality of the European Commission, who is center stage, when it's about stemming an immediate crisis, taking far-reaching, controversial decisions on lots of money, on war and peace, you really need to bring in as Union, the top players, those who have the most political authority also to convince their public opinions, to convince sometimes reluctant parliaments to take these decisions. Now, among academics, as you may know, there's a whole debate whether this is changing the institutional setup of the European Union or not. In my view, not really, because the European Council, just to mention that point, has always been conceived to play this role, to be a crisis manager. The trouble is, obviously, that there have been more of these crises than in the past, and that we will probably remain in such a kind of situation. Because also the challenges the European Union are faced with are much more important today for the public, for voters, for all of them, than they used to be in the old days of the market when it was more a stakeholders affair. So that's for a first general presentation. So back to you.
You bring two very important elements to the discussion here. Let me put those out and hear your reaction. On the one hand, what we witnessed recently, particularly since the Euro crisis, but as you said, right from also tackling the refugee crisis, Brexit, and the many crises that have affected the Union in the last 10 or 12 years. On the one hand, you see an increased politicization of these issues. So refugees and borders, the ever integration of the European Union or its disintegration with Brexit, pooling and sharing resources at the economic level and thus raising common debt or not. All these issues are very political. And as you rightly said, the public has become more aware of these issues, which also means that at the same time, these issues are more contested. It's not only that they are more political, it's also that there are different views and increasing opposing views on the way to deal with these issues. This clashes very much with the idea of the Union as a technocratic body or as a technocratic institution dealing with affairs beyond politics or outside of the scope of politics. So this is the first, to me, big development that you are putting forward. The second one, and probably as a consequence of this first one, is that then decisions are more difficult to take because since there is more contestation, leaders have less of a margin of maneuver to basically do their own business in Brussels as if this was outside of what happens back home. So in other words, Brussels has become home and home has become Brussels. And you have this double dimension. And here's the question. Taking these two factors into account, how important is or how feasible it is, let me put it this way, for leaders to basically act in the interest of the Union as a whole and not be subject only to what they will hear when they go back home and they will be contested on the decisions that they have taken when in Brussels. So how are leaders able to cope with this transformation of the way European politics have unfolded?
I think that's a very good question, Paul. And I think you rightly bring in the issue of the end of technocracy in the sense of the, well, sometimes a reality, but sometimes an illusion that any political issue is a kind of technical problem which you can solve, whereas the issues the European Union is now dealing are much more often about clashing values and interests, with distributional consequences, which are very much in the spotlight, social economic consequences, etc. I think for leaders to convincingly deal with these issues, there's two sides to that response. First is, let's say, on the way of doing politics. The second is on the policies themselves, on the substance of the decisions. Now, on the way of doing politics, I think what you can see in those leaders who are best at this, at playing this double game, both at home with their national opinions and in Europe, be it in the European Council or in the relations with the European Parliament, is obviously to make the point time and time again that European interests and national interests are aligned, or that the national interests, many of them in the long term, but many even also in the short term, are better served by a stronger or a common approach to these issues. Well, you mentioned the refugee crisis, where it is still very difficult. So maybe it's not the best example, but it's very powerful example in terms of public emotions and expectations, deep divisions between member states, between, let's say, southern or Mediterranean states who have to deal with the rivals, northern and eastern who have their own interests at stake. But where you do see, nevertheless, a realization of a shared interest in protecting jointly a border, the external border. So, well, I'm Dutch. I live in Belgium, but for the Belgians, the people from the Netherlands, the Germans, they understand today that the border between Greece and Turkey, to take that one, is also their border. It's a European border. It's not only the Greek border. So I think there's really also a growing understanding of the public that these interests are aligned. But it does require for the politicians also to speak in terms of interests. And maybe we come to that later also when we talk about the geopolitical dimension. So I'll leave that point here, but it's important for the EU to not only be associated with values, with doing well, but also defending core interests. And that makes it also easier to align expectations voters may have in the national setting and what they think of and how they look at Europe. So this already points at the same time to the way of doing politics and also changing policies. Because I think one of the responses, if you compare the consensus in policy making between now and 10 years ago, there's much more attention to the idea that Europe has to protect, to take a key word. So the European Union, which was conceived to produce freedoms, liberties, possibilities, Erasmus students traveling around, companies selling all across the continent, all that, which was a great show for entrepreneurs, young people, etc. There is a realization, and I would take 2016, the Brexit vote, as a kind of turnaround, as a shift, that the European Union also needs to protect, to offer something to those people who do not necessarily see that European Union of opportunities and chances as an opportunity, but maybe as a risk, because they are not the ones going abroad to make money, but they see competition on the labor market, they see changing neighborhoods, etc. And I think that shift is very essential, and it is really against the DNA almost of the European Union, this idea of European Union that protects. And I think it has been very important to safeguard the whole fabric of the European Union in these years. And I mentioned 2016, and of course Brexit, but also the year of the Trump election in the US, when at some point it looked like this gulf of anti-liberal political revolts would also engulf the European Union itself.
So from freedom to protection is something that is clearly representative of many of the issues that you've put forward and that we've been discussing for the last few years. But I'd like now to push you a bit further on the way this is actually implemented and done at the European Council, because you know its workings very, very well. You were referring before to the centrality of heads of state and government and the top jobs when deciding on European politics. Do you think that this reliance, and some say over-reliance, on the European Council to take on board most of the decisions is perhaps also leading to a certain dysfunctioning when it comes to their ability to cope with all these issues? And what should thus be the role of the European Council, not to fall into tasks of micromanagement, and instead be able to put forward the big picture, the big key decisions, the political guidance of the European Union? Do you think this is still possible with the institutional architecture that we have at this point?
Yes, I think so, but I do understand the worries that if too many issues become so controversial that they can only be dealt with at the level of the leaders, the whole system gets choked, basically. And it's not so easy to find a way around. I mean, for those who are in the know of these things, there have for ages been high hopes that one of the councils of ministers, namely the so-called Council of the General Affairs Council, would in a way work to prepare and deal with the less toxic, less salient issues, let's say in the preparatory phase, so as to lower the burden for the European Council. But this somehow never really works. We can talk longer about it, but we'll get a bit technical. But it's a kind of hope which is each time disappointed. Of course, there's also something about the relationship here between the European Council and the European Commission, where one thing I always find important to stress is that the president of the European Commission, so today Ursula von der Leyen, is a full member of the European Council. So she's there. The European Council is not only national leaders, it includes the president of the Commission. And if the president of the Commission plays it well, she, in this case, can really use this as a springboard for action to make the case for joint action. And this is what Jacques Delors, who is in Brussels still very popular among middle-aged civil servants who were recruited when he was in office, did very well with his authority, etc. Of course, you will always end up with border conflicts, let's say, as you have in any institutional setup, between who does what. The Commission on its side has the so-called monopoly of the initiative, whereas the European Council is there to set the general orientations, as you also mentioned. So that is, and it's not always clear where one thing ends and the other begins, because in practice, sometimes even tiny details can be very political, and luckily that is not with all discussions, but that is why sometimes, and indeed I have witnessed this, already more than 5-6 years ago, but that in the middle of the night, you see really heads of state of government in the corridors when they were still meeting, outside the meeting room, scribbling on a piece of paper and trying to find a formula which is acceptable to all. And that is, that's a specificity also of the European Council, that involvement, personal involvement of leaders with every sentence they decide and they write up. And why is this? And this goes back to your earlier point, because they know it matters to them at home. Because they know it is not some lofty declaration at the United Nations or at the G7 that is taking place these days, but it's really something which their press, their parliament, their opposition will look at what they have signed up to. And sometimes that's politics. It's not always predictable what point will prove salient, but it's so it creates, I agree with these worries, it creates sometimes a backlog, and the European Council is very bad at anticipating, at looking ahead. It is really event-driven, crisis-driven, which makes it, which has the risk of creating fear, basically. In French, you could say anxiogène. It can only act as institution when the situation is difficult, and that is not always so sound or productive. But there, I don't see really an alternative.
We've covered the first part, which is internal politics and functioning and the shortcomings, but also trying to understand why the system works the way it works. Let me move from Brussels to the outside world. Let me make a turn here and start covering one of the aspects that, if you look at recent polling, most citizens put forward as one of Europe's biggest priorities, or what should be Europe's biggest and leading priorities, which is to have a stronger global role, a stronger foreign policy, and of course also a stronger capacity to influence development and to have the tools, and that might be on issues of defense or others, to have the tools to actually shape the world in Europe's image. When it comes to the EU's global role, you describe a moment of geopolitical awakening as a combination of basically three factors. You put forward the idea that geopolitics is a question of power, it's a question of territory, but it's also a question of narrative. Can you elaborate a bit on the combination of these three factors, power, territory, and narrative, with the aim of being a successful global actor?
Yeah, with pleasure, Paul. I had the occasion indeed this spring to develop some of these ideas in Paris at the Collège de France. And I wanted to do this because I have the impression that many in Brussels and around are basically underestimating how radical the shift is to thinking about Europe in terms of geopolitics. So it's very easy to say, as von der Leyen has done, okay, I want to run a geopolitical commission. But what does it mean? And in my view, it is really at odds with everything the European Union has stood for historically. It is not about just adding another key or tool or hammer to your toolbox. It's really changing your worldview, your ethos, the way you behave. And I indeed can illustrate that with these three key words. The first is power. Any geopolitical actor, and that's what defines it basically, will use not only the law or money to achieve its aims, but also power. Well, this can be anything. This can be also, let's say, access to the vaccine, to take a very current example as a source of power. It can be access to a port, but obviously military power is part of that. Now, and that is really something the European Union is not equipped to do, because it was built to get out of a world of power after 2 world wars. It was built, and it was a great invention and exploration of building an international, internally in Europe, framework based on the law and on the market. So to add power to that mix, as I said, it's not just an extra tool, it's completely putting yourself upside down. Territory is a bit the same, in the sense that clearly a geopolitical actor acts from a certain space. Geopolitics is not only power politics, there's also this element of of the geography, of the territory, which comes to it. And therefore it matters where you are on the map. Not only geographically, you're in Barcelona, so you have the Mediterranean, it's really different from Madrid or from Lisboa, but also it matters between what powers on the map you are. Well, in the case of Spain, you're rather far away from Russia, behind the Pyrenees, which feels kind of safe, whereas you're more exposed to the south, obviously. These very obvious things, but they somehow were almost forgotten, these kind of very basic elementary differences in the Brussels discourse. And you see it most clearly with the whole idea of borders. Huh? The European Union was there to eliminate borders, to tear down this wall, the biggest border of them all, the Berlin Wall. But now what we see is that thinking in terms of territory, it becomes important also to defend your borders, to defend the territory. Look at the violent, or not entirely violent, but skirmishes in the Eastern Mediterranean between Turkey and Greece recently, or obviously look at Russia. So there also, the European Union needs to think in terms of borders not as something from the past to abolish. Well, that's fine internally, but still externally, external borders we need to have and to protect in a world where you have Russia and Turkey, etc. Now, narrative is what every geopolitical actor needs to tell a story about a certain about a certain community. You use this power, you have this territory, but you also need a kind of collective identity, and this can be very weak, but a sense of common destiny of the people on whose behalf you are engaging in global politics. And that requires, as I said, a sense of we. I mean, when the US president talks about the American role in the world, it's very obvious for him what narrative he is embodying, basically, as American president. It's a narrative about a great country, a force for the good in the world with its history. The Chinese president also embodies a kind of narrative of China as a great civilization, which after a century of humiliation is now on the way back to global primacy, etc. But the Europeans have difficulty to embody and to express a narrative about us Europeans. Because it's either us Frenchmen and Germans, that's our the national identities, or when it's about Europe, it's almost immediately about universal values, about democracy, human rights, and all these other articles, very important values listed in Article 2 of the Union Treaty. But it is hardly ever about our common history. Sometimes it is in EU prose as if Europe was born on the 9th of May 1950 when French Minister Schuman did the first proposal for what is now the EU, forgetting about 25 centuries, let's say, of ancient civilization and everything which has shaped Europe as it is today. And I think without that, we cannot do geopolitics.
Following up on the narrative, let me, and now we will move to more substantial issues to close our conversation. But I have the feeling that when you speak about Europe's narrative towards the outside world, the way it projects itself, Europe tends to be quite good at two parts of what a strategy should be about when dealing with the world. It tends to read the state of affairs quite well. It tends to understand the way the world is evolving quite well. And it did so in 2003 with the European security strategy, and it did so again in 2016 with the global strategy. It also tends to identify quite properly the threats that emanate from this more convulsed, more complex world. But it performs quite poorly in the other two parts of the story of what a strategy is, which are the interests that it wants to put forward when confronting this world, this troublesome world, and the instruments that it has at its disposal to actually pursue such interests. And thus, as a consequence of this, we tend to be very good readers of how things are evolving around us. We tend to be quite poor performers when it comes to actually acting upon those changing realities, right? And this, I would say, and this is where I would like to lead you now, is even more the case today with the relations with the big powers. When you speak about relations with Russia, as you rightly pointed out, it's very difficult. It's very different to look at it from Spain than it is to look at it from Lithuania. And when you speak about China, it's very difficult. It's very different if you look at China as a market opportunity or if you look at it as an authoritarian regime. And these perceptions are very different across member states. And when it comes to the United States, it is the indispensable ally, or it is someone you want to somehow rival with when it comes to acting on the global stage. Show me a bit how you think Europe should interact with these big powers, and what should be a good strategy for confronting this ever more multipolar world that we are witnessing.
Well, that's a big one, Paul, to conclude with. But I would say that the first thing to do is to assert the fact that we Europeans have interests, that there are certain interests which we share as Europeans: territorial, security, others. I just mentioned also already the Greek-Turkish border, which is a European security interest. And also that these interests may diverge from American interests. In my view, that's one of the key issues for the years, months and years ahead. Because as long as Europeans only look at the world in terms of values, which we want to uphold or promote, and everything which we have done and which we used to be good at because we were in a position of power, in fact, so we could spread our values backed up by power, our own power or American power. As long as we see the world only in terms of values, we will, in a way, in the big game of the 21st century, end up in the arms of the Americans, because they have the same language of values, democracy, human rights, as we have. And that's, let's say, the narrative of a new Cold War, which will be led by the US against China, and where, in the name of democracy, we will line up as loyal vassals, to put it that way. Now, there may obviously, and there are very good reasons to side with the US in this value battle with China. But this completely overlooks that we may have, and indeed do have, more and more diverging interests from the United States. If you think about our relationship with Russia, which we already mentioned, which is very different for us and for them. Even more clearly, the Middle East or Africa, where we have a deep interest, security, economically, migration, to have a region which is prospering as much as possible, which is not at war. So we have no interest, as Trump didn't really mind in play up the risk of a war with Iran, because we think in Europe it may end up with millions of migrants coming our way, or etc. All these. And there, it's really the geopolitics which comes in. Huh? For us, the South is Africa and the Middle East. For Joe Biden, as his administration, it is Latin America, and he has his own border crisis there. But we don't need to go into that. You in Spain know more about it than many people. And also, therefore, or on the side rather, economically, we have different interests in our relations with China. And when we forget about those, it's not, then we also forget about let's say, jobs or about security. No? So what we have to learn is that if we want to stand up for our values the way we used to do, with sanctions, etc., this now comes with a price. It was not the case in the past, but it now comes with a price. Maybe we want to pay that price for very good reasons, but at least we should have an open public debate, both politically but also publicly, about how are we going to bring together and judge. These are strategic interests, these are red lines, these are core values which we do want to uphold. But where do we draw the line? And that is, I mean, I'm almost sad to have to say these things. It is so elementary and so obvious that that's what you have to do as a power or as a great power. But we don't do this as Europeans. We don't even make this calculation between interests and values because we are so wedded to the values that we forget to think, to anticipate in terms of our interest until a big crisis hits, like with Russia, like with Turkey. And I can take one example, the EU migration deal. That's been very controversial, very important. Also in my analysis, it's really a key decision. There you could see that, okay, there the interests were getting so high. The risks, political risks of not getting the situation under control was so big that the EU was willing and able to jump over its own shadow and to do something which perhaps was against its own values, morally and ethically. But if you only do this in moments of existential crisis, you're in a very weak position. If we are unable to articulate a discourse of what really we want to defend, because we're no longer, I mean, power relations are changing. We're no longer in, as you said, making a world more like Europe. No, it's now an era of defending our way of life vis-a-vis other powers, and where we therefore have to articulate very clearly what it is that we want to defend, what we give away, and where we stand up for our values. That is for me crucial, and we haven't even started. So that's a job for think tanks, but as you rightly say, think tanks, I mean, that's a bit what EU foreign policy sometimes look like. It's great think tanking, but we have to add the action part.
Absolutely. And on this note, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, internally and externally speaking, for the future of the European Union. There's much more we could cover, but we will leave it here, and we will have the occasion certainly to take again some of these issues in a next conversation. Luuk van Middelaar, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for your time and for discussing in a very short time 3 major works that you've done over the last few years. So it's been a real pleasure to listening to you.
Thank you again, Paul. It was a pleasure to be with you. Hope to see you in real life someday.
Someday, hopefully.